Nuclear war wasn't just a Cold War fantasy, it was a constant shadow. For decades, the world lived one wrong signal away from ending itself. Governments built bunkers, schools practiced duck and cover. And Hollywood? It didn't let anyone forget how fragile survival really was. These films didn't give us happy endings or heroic rescues. They gave us nightmares. Stories that forced people to look straight into the abyss and wonder if humanity had already written its own ending. So, let's take a journey through the films that dared to imagine the unimaginable. The day after 1983, the night television stopped breathing. It was a quiet Sunday evening when America turned on its televisions and saw the end of the world. On November 20th, 1983, ABC aired The Day After, and nothing on TV would ever feel the same again. This wasn't a sci-fi adventure or some faraway apocalypse. It was a brutally realistic story about Kansas' ordinary families, students, and doctors caught in the middle of a nuclear strike. No warning, no buildup, no escape. When the bombs fell, everything familiar turned to ash. Hospitals overflowed. The air turned to poison. Families vanished in seconds. There were no dramatic rescues, no speeches about hope, just quiet, suffocating horror. Over 100 million Americans watched that night. That's nearly half the country. Teachers, priests, parents, all sat in silence as the credits rolled. The next morning, churches held emergency discussions. Schools let kids talk about what they saw because the trauma was real. Even President Ronald Reagan confessed in his diary that the movie left him deeply depressed. The Pentagon hated it. Why? Because it suggested nuclear war might start by accident, not by Soviet aggression. Director Nicholas Meyer refused to tone it down. He wanted America to feel it, and it worked. For many, The Day After wasn't a movie. It was a national therapy session, a televised panic attack. It made people question not just whether nuclear war could happen, but whether anyone would survive long enough to regret it. But that wasn't the only time Hollywood forced people to stare into the fire. Testament 1983, The Quiet End of Everything. The same year, The Day After left audiences shattered. Another film came along and whispered something even darker. Testament. No explosions, no mushroom clouds, no soldiers, just a small town in California trying to survive after the bombs have already fallen. The horror in Testament isn't loud, it's quiet. The story follows a mother played by Jane Alexander who's desperately trying to keep her children alive as the world slowly unravels outside their home. The electricity dies, food disappears, and then, one by one, so do their neighbors. There's a scene where the family holds a small birthday party, pretending everything's fine. The candles glow softly, the kids smile, and outside the world is dying. That quiet denial hits harder than any explosion ever could. Critics were stunned. Roger Ebert called it one of the most powerful films he'd ever seen. Paramount Pictures gave it a theatrical release, even though it was made for television. Because it wasn't just a movie, it was grief captured on film. While The Day After screamed in terror, Testament whispered. And sometimes, the whispers are what haunt you most. But not every nuclear story unfolded slowly. Some began with a single, terrifying mistake. Miracle Mile, 1988. One call away from the end. It starts like a romance. Boy meets girl in Los Angeles. They fall in love. Everything feels light, hopeful, maybe even funny. Then one night, the phone rings. On the other end, a panicked voice screams, "The missiles are already on their way." And just like that, Miracle Mile becomes one of the most terrifying real-time apocalypses ever filmed. Anthony Edwards plays Harry, an ordinary guy who accidentally overhears the end of the world. From that phone call on, the clock is ticking. Rumors spread like wildfire. Panic turns to riots. Gas stations explode. Streets flood with chaos. The entire movie unfolds almost in real time. You can feel the minutes slipping away as Harry races through the city, desperate to find his girlfriend before it's too late. But the most disturbing part is that you're never sure if it's real or just mass hysteria. Director Steve DeJarnette refused studio pressure to add a happy ending, and that decision made Miracle Mile unforgettable. The final scene, two lovers trapped beneath the city as the sky ignites, feels like a heartbeat fading away. It's not a story about bombs, it's a story about belief, about how one rumor, one mistake, can tear society apart faster than any explosion. But what if the end didn't come as panic or spectacle but as a news report? Special Bulletin 1983, when news became a weapon. 9 months before the day after, NBC pulled off one of the boldest and most dangerous TV stunts in history. Special Bulletin didn't look like a movie. It looked like breaking news. Viewers in Charleston, South Carolina, tuned in expecting their local programming. Instead, they saw live footage of reporters covering what appeared to be a labor protest at a dockyard. Within minutes, the protest escalated into a full-blown terrorist standoff. The intruders had smuggled in a homemade nuclear bomb and threatened to detonate it if their demands weren't met. Everything looked real. Shaky cameras, anchors stumbling over words, reporters shouting over static. Even disclaimers couldn't stop the panic. Phone lines jammed as people called the station, convinced they were watching the start of World War III unfold live. And when the movie ended in total devastation, viewers were left shaken, angry, and confused. Special Bulletin went on to win multiple Emmys and critical praise. But it also raised a haunting question. How much power does the media really have over public fear? It blurred the line between truth and fiction so well that many people never looked at news broadcasts the same way again. But even before these 1980s nightmares, there was one film that quietly prepared audiences for the unthinkable. On the Beach, 1959, Waiting for the Last Breath. Before color television, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, before mushroom clouds filled movie screens, there was On the Beach. Released in 1959, it wasn't about the war itself. It was about what came after. The bombs had already fallen. The Northern Hemisphere was gone. And the last remnants of humanity, in Australia, were simply waiting for the fallout to reach them. Gregory Peck played a submarine captain haunted by duty. Ava Gardner portrayed a woman trying to drink away her fear. And Fred Astaire, yes, the elegant dancer, played a broken man staring at the inevitable. The beauty of On the Beach lies in its stillness. No explosions, no violence, just people pretending life is normal, while knowing every breath could be their last. Critics were divided. Some called it un-American for being so bleak. Even President Eisenhower reportedly disliked it. But others saw it for what it was, a quiet masterpiece about acceptance, mortality, and the futility of denial. Its question lingers even today. If you knew the end was certain, how would you live your final days? And just when people thought that fear was behind them, the 1990s reminded everyone that peace was just an illusion. By dawn's early light, 1990, the mistake that could end it all. By the end of the 1980s, the Cold War seemed to be melting away. The Berlin Wall was falling, the tension easing. People finally began to believe the nightmare was over. Then HBO released By Dawn's Early Light, a chilling reminder that the end could still come by accident. The story begins when a rogue Soviet faction launches a nuclear strike in an attempt to restart the conflict. The United States scrambles to respond, but the chain of command fractures under pressure. Confusion, ego, and pride take control. Inside the White House, Martin Landau plays the president torn between retaliation and restraint. In the skies, fighter pilots played by Powers Booth and Rebecca De Mornay wait for orders they pray never come. What makes By Dawn's Early Light so terrifying isn't what you see, it's what you know could happen. A single miscommunication, a misread radar blip, and the world burns. The film's realism hit hard. Critics called it the last great Cold War thriller, a warning that the apocalypse might come not from hatred, but from human error. But years before, another film had already imagined that collapse, not as a military thriller, but as a family's desperate fight to survive. Panic in Year Zero, 1962. When morality burns first. Before zombies and prepper culture, there was panic in Year Zero. Released in 1962, it followed a father, mother, and their 2 children heading out for a camping trip when nuclear bombs strike Los Angeles. Suddenly, the family's simple road trip turns into a brutal fight for survival. Highways clog with terrified drivers. Stores get looted. People turn on each other. Ray Milland, who also directed the film, plays the father, an ordinary man slowly turning ruthless. At first, he's protecting his family, but soon, that protection becomes paranoia. He stockpiles supplies, threatens strangers, and does things he never thought himself capable of. The message was brutal and ahead of its time. When society collapses, morality is the first casualty. Critics dismissed it as pulp fiction, but decades later, it feels eerily prophetic. The film predicted the same themes that modern shows, like The Walking Dead, thrive on: the idea that survival isn't just about the bombs, but what the bombs do to people. Panic in Year Zero wasn't just entertainment. It was a mirror. And sometimes, the reflection is the scariest part. The Bedford Incident, 1965. Pride before the fall. Not every nuclear story happens in a burning city. Some unfold in silence, deep beneath the sea. In the Bedford Incident, released in 1965, a U.S. destroyer shadows a Soviet submarine in icy northern waters. What starts as routine surveillance becomes a deadly psychological duel. Richard Widmark plays the ship's captain, unyielding, prideful, and obsessed with winning a game of cat and mouse. Sidney Poitier plays a journalist on board, documenting the tension as the crew unravels. Every order, every word drips with paranoia. One wrong command could start the war no one wants. The film ends not with victory, but with tragedy. A single misunderstanding that brings total destruction. Critics compared it to Fail Safe, another nuclear thriller from the same era, but the Bedford Incident was more personal. It wasn't about politics, it was about pride. It showed that Armageddon doesn't require villains, just humans, too proud to back down. And then, in the 1980s, television blurred the line between news and nightmare again. Countdown to Looking Glass, 1984. Watching the end on live TV. If Special Bulletin blurred reality, Countdown to Looking Glass shattered it completely. A Canadian-American co-production that aired on HBO in 1984, it looked nothing like a movie. It looked like real-time news coverage. Anchors calmly discussed global economic collapse, political tension, and finally military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were no explosions, no special effects, just calm voices describing chaos. Viewers watched financial markets crumble, diplomats argue, and then silence. And when the nuclear war finally began, it wasn't shown with spectacle, it was reported, as if the world had just ended, and the news team was still doing their job. That realism hit a nerve. Critics praised it for authenticity. Audiences were shaken because it felt like a rehearsal for the real thing. You didn't see the world end, you heard it, through the voice of an anchor trying not to cry. If the day after was a scream, Countdown to Looking Glass was the calm before the scream, the unbearable stillness when everyone realizes it's already too late. The Atomic Cafe, 1982. The Smiling Lie. Now imagine watching the end of the world, but with cheerful music playing in the background. That's The Atomic Cafe, a documentary made entirely of real government propaganda from the 1940s and 50s. No narration, no commentary, just reality. You see soldiers marching toward blast zones, smiling, teachers telling children to hide under desks, Cartoon turtles explaining how to survive radiation by ducking under a table. It's funny at first, until it isn't, because every clip is real. These were the films the US government used to calm a terrified nation. The Atomic Cafe turns those clips into a surreal nightmare. The contrast between cheerful voices and devastating imagery exposes a chilling truth. People were taught to live with annihilation. Critics praised it as darkly hilarious, but the laughter always caught in your throat. Because beneath the satire was something horrifyingly sincere. How easy it was to make people believe everything would be fine, even when it clearly wasn't. And then, in 1964, one director took that same absurdity and turned it into a masterpiece of black comedy. Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Laughing at the end. Only Stanley Kubrick could make the apocalypse funny. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is one of the most daring films ever made. At the height of Cold War paranoia, it turned nuclear annihilation into a dark, biting joke. Peter Sellers played 3 different characters, including the unforgettable Dr. Strangelove, a wheelchair-bound scientist whose own arm seems possessed by evil. George C. Scott chewed through dialogue as a war-hungry general. Sterling Hayden portrayed a paranoid officer whose delusions trigger the end of humanity. The film's brilliance lies in how absurd it all feels, and how terrifyingly real it still is. Meetings in the war room become comedy sketches, but beneath the laughter, you can feel the dread. And that ending the world exploding in slow motion to the tune of Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again is both hilarious and horrifying. Kubrick's message was clear. It's not monsters or villains that will destroy us. It's bureaucracy, pride, and stupidity. Humanity doesn't go out in hatred, it goes out in a paperwork error. Conclusion: the fear that never died. From On the Beach to The Day After, from satire to terror, these films all carried the same message. The bomb isn't the true danger. We are. Every generation thought the threat would fade. It never did. It just changed shape from Cold War politics to misinformation, from missiles to AI and cyber war. The fear evolved, but it never really left. Maybe that's why these films still hit so hard. They're not relics of history, they're mirrors. Reminders that peace has always been fragile and survival never guaranteed. The most chilling thing isn't watching the world end on screen. It's realizing how close we've come again and again, and how easily it could happen still. So, which of these stories shook you the most? Was it the chaos of The Day After, the quiet heartbreak of Testament, or the dark laughter of Dr. Strangelove? Let me know in the comments, and remember, some warnings never expire.